So good afternoon. Welcome to the latest ATTA webinar. We will be kicking off in just a couple of minutes. I'm just going to wait for people to be able to come and join the room. So just sit tight and you'll soon be hearing from our guest presenter, Michael Jackson. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the latest ATTA webinar. Today, rather than a members webinar, we've got an online talk from global conference expert Michael Jackson. Last year, we were fortunate enough to have Michael join us at Experience Africa. And a year ago today, we were about to wrap up the show with our media awards and a chat on stage with Charlie Borman. This year's edition of Experience Africa should have been wrapping up today, but sadly, that's not the case. So it is very apt to have Michael joining us today. Michael has over 30 years of strategic business, marketing, and communication experience, and has worked personally with business leaders such as Bill Gates and Richard Branson. And I'm very pleased to have Michael with us today to take us through some innovative thinking and leadership through communication. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please type these into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and we'll address them at the end of the session. After the webinar, we're hosting an online social meeting and I'll put the link in the registration, link for the registration rather, in the chat box. So please grab a drink and come and join us afterwards. So time to get on with the show and I'd like to hand the stage over to you, Michael.
Well, a very good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for taking time out of your schedule to come over and join us. You know, it is a little bit ironic. We were just chatting in the meeting room before we started this webinar. 1 year ago today, wrapping up Experience Africa. I mean, what a world change we've lived through in those last 12 months. And that really is what I hope to share a little bit about with you this afternoon in terms of the presentation that I briefly have lined up for you. As Chris says, I'm very, very happy to take questions with you at any stage as well. For anything that you require, please use the Q&A box. I'm also looking at the chat box as I present and just talking to you a little bit about innovative thinking. Even though it's not travel and tourism specific, it will encompass everything that you need to think about in terms of your business lives going forward. And I wanted to try and make it as generic as possible so that it would appeal to as many of us who are watching as possible as well. You know, in terms of taking your business beyond 2020, we have to move beyond that virus scenario. And I think that, you know, we all sat back at the end of 2019, glass of something in hand on New Year's Eve, wherever we were in the world, going, this is going to be fantastic. I mean, after all, 2020 had been promised to us by everybody, including science fiction writers, as the ultimate utopia. This was where the world was really coming into its maturity, allegedly so anyway, and it was meant to deliver a tech smart, a seamless, a much more connected and better planet that awaited us all. We were all eternally optimistic that night, and indeed for the first few weeks of January until news started coming out from Wuhan. So where did we find ourselves and why did we find ourselves in this strange, precarious situation? You know, modernity kept delivering faster change. Our generation, the people living alive on the planet today, have seen more change than any other generation of humans that's ever lived before. And if you think back now to living memory, you know, the moon landings, when Apollo 11 touched down on the moon just over 50 years ago now, that really heralded for us the dawn of this new technological era in which we find ourselves. We've seen decade by decade change consistently since those moon landings. You know, we got personal computers in the 1970s. We got mobile phones into the 1980s. And then what we're talking on now, the internet, rolled around in the 1990s as well, leading us to the start of the new century, collaboration globally being the order of the day. And then, of course, what the IT people had been talking about last year and everyone expected for 2020 itself, convergence would kick off this new globalized era of a fantastic lifestyle. In many respects, all of us as people living on the planet expected business as usual. Why would we not? It was exactly what we were thinking was coming down the line. And our strategies, our business management, our planning, our communication methodologies, all of it was designed for this utopian 2020 world. Everybody completely failed to predict the future. Wow. Now, why was that? Before we go into what our future looks like and what happened to us as a result of this damned virus. You know, we're humans, we're top of the tree, we're apex predators. But because of that, we're also creatures of habit. And we found ourselves bound, even through those decades of change, by our familiar routines, our habits, our practices. We just expected in the background things would get simpler, faster, better, and cheaper. But in fact, we were stagnating. And all of it at a time of massive human distrust as well. You know, wherever you're watching this from around the world right now, you think about, you know, what's your belief about governments? Well, largely that they're incompetent. When you think about the media, that Donald himself coined the phrase, oh man, it's fake news, right? And our planet has largely been seen and discussed in the media as becoming more and more toxic, and business as its own right was becoming seen as more and more corrupt. So all of these trends had kind of emerged while we were in this routine, this habit, and the planet was indeed changing, but it was perhaps hard for us to notice it until it started getting a little bit closer to home. Globalized flashpoints developed. And you can think that those come in many, many different ways. We have the politics, and there's a long red tie there for a reason. We have trade issues and trade wars happening around the planet right now as well. And we're also suffering from what we think about, these immigration issues and the toxicity of all our pollution. We all know about plastics in the ocean because the media has been hammering that through to us. And when you look at protests and public demonstrations of populism against populist politics in recent times, it's not hard to see how polarized individual humans had become, and indeed were rapidly becoming more and more extreme. So let me introduce you to a man who doesn't get often mentioned in business presentations, a Russian, Vladimir himself, who said, Lenin said about 100 years ago now, he said, look, this was one of his best quotes ever. And if you don't speak Russian or don't read Cyrillic, let me translate it for you. There are decades, he says, when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And that's what we've been living through. Weeks as decades happened. The perfect black swan, as it's known, this totally unexpected, unpredicted, unrecognizable event landed upon us with full force. And we all know it, obviously, in terms of its coronavirus pandemic. But we've seen black swans before. However you're feeling about your lockdown and your circumstance and your situation right now, let me take you back to Black Monday in 1987, when, you know, excessive risk-taking on the stock market then caused, you might remember, the subprime fiasco. Markets plunged, everything fell off a cliff, and the world, by the way, interestingly, took 1,000-odd days to recover. Then we've seen another black swan in our lifetimes, the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, a little bit more recent in the memory, perhaps. Another subprime fiasco here, risk-taking on high stocks, and 400 days for recovery. So how long is it going to take us to recover from this black swan? Our estimation for recovery is, in fact, by 2025. And when I say recovery, what does it mean? Will it be normal as we once knew it? Or will it be a globe that's trading and working with all of its flashpoints and all of the continuous issues being developed? Well, that's something we're going to have to figure out. So let's get there. Everything changed instantly the minute that virus came into our human lifestyles. And as a result of it, it just caused all kinds of chaos. The initial response to any form of change, once you've learned it beyond ignorance, is about disbelief. It's then uncertainty, it's confusion, and indeed a sense of anger. Now, you might be somewhere on that chart right now in terms of where you are. And in many respects, I wanted to show you this image of Clyde Beatty, who was the best ever lion tamer. And I know that lion tamers quite rightly are very much out of favor at the moment, but go back 100 years to the world of circus and lion tamers that used to have these large beasts cowering before them. Before Clyde Beatty used to turn up with a whip. It made a huge noise and startled the lion. Clyde was the longest living lion tamer ever in circus history. He lived to the ripe old age of 67, in fact, and he did something extraordinary that nobody had done before. Apart from the whip, he took in what you can see on the image before you into the ring, a chair with 4 legs, and he waved it in front of the lion, much more than he cracked the whip. The result of that information overload caused one of 3 responses, as it does in mammals. We're exactly the same. Do you take flight? Do you stand and fight? Or do you freeze? And when information overload comes at you, what generally happens is what the lions did in those days. They chose to freeze. And that's why Clyde Beatty lived as long as he did. Just those chairs waving around, the legs of it were enough to startle the lions. Well, our governments became lions in terms of what happened when coronavirus hit. They froze, just like the lion did in the circus ring. Lockdown happened, and some 2 billion people around the planet were placed into quarantine. So what happened to us? Our work-life routines were disrupted, certainly. Lockdowns irritated us enormously, and social media erupted, quite rightly so, in a populist sense. We were confused, we were angry, we were fearful. And what had happened around us was that a strange thing that none of us really work with on a day-to-day basis, science tended to prevail, and literally business leadership disappeared, which was a very sad thing for me and a lot of organizations, because what people were most looking for, and here's a tip for what we should be doing moving beyond this virus, is to reinstigate a sense of business leadership immediately, rather than deferring to our frozen governments or the so-called scientists themselves. Our world needs, it's crying out for business leadership right now, because the scientists, or let's refer to them as the experts, aren't necessarily right. Nobody knows whether they're right or wrong right now. If you Google the definition of expert, it says, well, it's those who know. But what we do know about expert predictions is that people who make them fall into 2 categories. There are those who don't know, and there are those who don't know that they don't know. And that's where we are at the moment, being led by one of those 2 camps behind governments who are frozen into inactivity and deferring to the so-called science. It's kind of remarkable, really. You know, it's said now that if you took a chimpanzee and put a dart into its hand and pointed that chimpanzee in the direction of the dartboard, if the chimp threw the dart, it would have as much chance statistically of hitting the dartboard as any of the experts around the world in terms of being scientifically accurate with their predictions. So we're in the hands of chimpanzees with darts right now. What we do know in terms of freeze, however, apart from the recovery zone from where we find ourselves, is that a number of things have been predicted that are probably going to make sense. The worst recession to our planet since the 1930s. Let's weigh on our minds for a little in that particular region. Over 200 million jobs have been lost around the world right now, and 1.2 billion other jobs are at risk at this point in time, depending on how long it takes us to recover from the pandemic in its own right. It's estimated around the world that global trade will be down a minimum of 20%. America, and you can see why the Republicans are postulating in their election year right now, American trade, if it's lucky, will fall a minimum of 3%, if it's lucky. European trade, with or without Britain and Brexit, will go down at least 6%. You're interested in Africa specifically, it could be a minimum 7% drop in African trade. And strangely enough, the only economy that's going to grow is likely to be the Chinese. They were growing at 6.67% GDP growth before the virus hit. And because their economy was so large, even though it's taken a massive hit and is now busy reopening, they are the only economy in the world that's predicted to deliver any form of growth at a mean, miserable 1.2% in terms of the next 12 months of activity. So things are going to be tough. We know that. Business leadership is sadly missed. Things are going to be tough. We need to lead people through what I would term the classical change curve. Now, this is the Kubler-Ross change curve for those of you who've studied psychology or anything along those lines. It's an issue of grief. The basic premise is that, you want to go from A to B. The simplest distance is a short line, and you always hope that B is a little higher up than A, otherwise why bother changing? But in fact, as humans, because we're so resistant to change, we take this massive curve, which if I grabbed the end of the arrow and dragged into a straight line against the yellow line, it would be literally 3 times longer for us to get from virus to vaccine and make our world operate at the right levels. It's a strange concept. You see, the change curve, the curve of grief, the Kubler-Ross curve says, when a change is announced, when a black swan lands, as the virus did, our initial response was denial, even though the storm clouds had gathered. As you slip down the change curve of humanity and the way that your brain processes this information, you realize that things have gone wrong, you realize that things aren't as normal, and our next result is anger, if not fear, that comes through. And it takes a long while before we hit the base of the curve, which is acceptance. You see, our human brain is processed and programmed to give you all the negativity first, because your brain doesn't want to put itself and therefore you at risk. It wants you to consider all the negatives before we start moving towards the positives. And you can see now, in a time when business leadership is lost, that literally when people out there are in denial, anger, fear, or fright stage, having frozen, they're a long, long way from acceptance and moving up the curve in terms of some hope, some progress, some delivery, and finally, boom, some belief when the sun comes out and shines. So we've got to talk ourselves through this change curve. We've got to talk our industry, we've got to talk our business, we've got to talk our employees through the curve. Because if this vaccine to virus scenario or virus to vaccine scenario is at least 5 years, we don't have 15 years, 3 times the length of it, to actually rebuild business and get ourselves trading on a global economic scale ever again. We've got to flatten the curve. And I don't mean the curve of virus to vaccine. People are working on that at a scientific level. Let them get on with it. We've got to flatten the curve and the change level. We've got to start leading people through different scenarios. It means a new formula for business at that particular level. The old formula, well, it was quite simple. If you did an MBA, and you always know when somebody had done an MBA, because they told you, correct? If you did an MBA last century, the essence of it was quite simple. Understand your past, they said, modify your behavior now around your present, and that should give you a sense of future. And that was how they taught MBAs until 1999. Today, you go to any leading institution that talks about MBAs, and they've got a very different formula. The formula they have says, it doesn't matter about your past. It doesn't matter about your present. What matters is your difference and your uniqueness, which if you're lucky and you promote it and develop it and sell it correctly, may, and there's no guarantee, but may give you a sense of future at the end of it all. And why not? There are 150 million registered businesses right now hoping to trade through the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are we going to do with our leadership? What are we going to do that helps people become different and think different, as well as applying our own business into a new situation? There is no new normal, I believe. And that phrase, I despise it, quite frankly, because as far as I'm concerned right now, we're going to be the new abnormal. There is no normal, and we'll talk about that a little later on just now as well. Our people are going to need help. And it's kind of intriguing because, again, if you studied marketing or business or psychology, you'll be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs at that particular level. He came up with this in 1943. And Maslow's hierarchy about how people progress from a functional survival level all the way up the scale into when they're buying art in art galleries was based on a psychological understanding of humans, our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. At the base, we wanted shelter and security, and that ensured our survival at that level. Around that survival, we then built safety. And above that, we wanted an emotional quotient of friends. We wanted to build on that emotion by having some esteem, and then the social level where we could actualize and end up in art galleries in that particular regard. But Maslow's principles were written during the Second World War. In our new world, there's a new hierarchy of needs. And if you think about what that means right now, let's understand it for what it is. At a functional level, we want Wi-Fi. And then the next thing in the morning that we want is coffee. And then after that, we want social media. And that social media gives us that esteem and that instant gratification. Ultimately, at the top of the tree now becomes purpose, where we find a cause or something we're prepared to believe in. And that's the way the modern mind is thinking after all the change that we've gone through in the last 50 years. So let's assume that Wi-Fi is a given and good coffee is widely available. You can understand why people have turned to social media to get their news and their views and their thoughts with all of that fake news that's going on in and around the social media platforms, and why they've spent longer in the downward part of the curve in despair, in anger, in denial. When you look at some of the world's best gurus and you ask them their favorite question, what did you get wrong 5 years ago? It's kind of intriguing that an awful lot of people got the social media aspect of life wrong. We thought it was the great democratizer. It gave a voice to everybody against the all-powerful governments. Well, it did, but it gave a voice to everybody, including the school bully who made a mess of your life when you were at junior school or high school. It gave the equal voice to everyone and has led us into the state in which we find ourselves now. If people are using that because they distrust everything else as their main source of media, perhaps not only do we need to understand that leadership is required, that we need to guide people through the curve, and we've got to change our manner and way of communicating because they need to get better information from us in the more widely acceptable world and built around a sense of purpose. And purpose has a really significant placement when it comes to the travel and tourism industries. So you can see the shape of where our new world needs to be. And when you interpret that into a business sense, let's look at the old hierarchy of business as it was, built on the classic pyramid, the CEO at the top, the generals, and the various layers of command down to the troops at the bottom. That was built on the military, for goodness sakes. That was built in the 1740s when we started the concept of business. And all it's led us to today is the shape of what business looks like. The yellow indication here says that businesses are typically very good, overly good at administration. They're overly stocked on management. They're not as good on communication. Collaboration starts to disappear. And when it comes to the other side of the curve, relationships, customer experience, the use of technology, well, there's no presence there whatsoever. And yet the market of the day wants to see collaboration, cries out for relationships, demands a customer experience, and is perfectly prepared because of its acceptance of the modern era to have that delivered through technology and soon artificial intelligence. You can see the V-shaped recovery that we need here is to get away from the old administrative managerial side into a new communicative customer relationship side of business. That means we need a new business focus, and we've got to start sharing that appropriately. Data science, well, we've not seen big data solve anything yet. We all know it was overhyped by the fake media. This is a relationship and human-driven planet. One of the things that you've missed more than anything else is the ability to connect, not in a social bubble, but you want to connect with the broader world, with your communities, with your people. And yet business has led us down the wrong path and failed in that communication methodology. Even as we were socially distanced, we were socially media distanced as well, which seems to be a nightmare of things. We've got to think about a new business focus at that level. You know, we need to start thinking now in our new world about driving communication to engage people more one-on-one and literally build it through the social media spaces. We need to refocus our business priorities to break away from the old style of the business scenarios that we looked at on administration, management, control, and start to unify our activities, more aligned towards best practices, more adaptive around the new level of the market sense, because we're going to have to drive and deliver new styles of business. It can be done. I think we've seen to a large extent how rapidly even politics, the well-known red tape and bureaucracy shackles of politics, how rapidly they were able to cut red tape and literally smash bureaucracy as our virus spread. Things that were considered unthinkable became normal and acceptable literally overnight. We've hidden far too long behind red tape and bureaucracy. And what we need to do is take a leaf out of the one thing that some governments did well at that level, to share a purpose-driven, focused platform and communicate it and work at it and do it swiftly with no aspect being paid to the red tape and the bureaucracy that stopped us before. It's about leadership through communication. And I guess if I were to try and sum up this presentation overall, you know, we need to package, we need to personalize, and we need to create better partnerships if we're going to break through and flatten this viral curve at that level. It starts internally inside your organization, and it's got to run externally all the way through to your market space and your customer base. You need to assess what's going on. You need to position your business better. We need to communicate this, and we need to repeat it ad infinitum until the message starts to get through. That's the only way I can see that we've got a chance of flattening our own business curve. Business was hard enough before the virus. We were struggling to meet people and technology and form partnerships. And we were engaged in that as much as the world was changing. Well, now for 2020, we've got to be a lot more agile. There are more connected people than ever before. There are more connected things than ever before. And as you can see from the slide, all of those things can be brought together with the biggest single thing that was missing right as the virus landed: business leadership. And it's quite simple, ladies and gentlemen. What we need to do are determine urgently the levels of importance and urgency of the things that are going on around us. Some things are highly important and highly urgent, and there are things in those areas that you need to learn. Once you've got the most important and most urgent things done, after that, there are some urgent but slightly less important things which have to be looked for. I'll explain this to you in a moment. Then there'll be some urgent but not so important things that we have to live with. And then finally, things that are neither urgent nor important that we have to let go. How do we look at those? Most important and most urgent today, things we need to learn about. People, customers, partners. It is their world that we have to move our businesses into. When you understand those people, your customers and your partners, you can then start to look for the ideas, the opportunities, and the growth. And the way that we all have to live, clearly, the right ethics, the right morals, and the right values. But then, what do we have to leave behind? How about this? The things we normally start with every single day of our lives because our brains are processed for it. Negativity, our habits, our routines. Isn't it strange how every morning we start bottom left and we should be thinking about starting top right? We need to shape our conversational design. We need to map and we need to learn the journey. By understanding our markets and our people and our places right now, we need to shape the message. We need to make sure that we're building it, packaging it, and then organizing a feedback loop so that this becomes a wheel that spins continuously. But it all starts with a level of co-creation and communication. You've got a unique formula you have to have in this industry in order to survive. But that formula has got to be presented to target markets on a co-created communicative platform if you want to generate trust and share the vision with it. You know, in terms of being connected, conversive, and supportive of your new ideas, of your people and behaviors, these now are the things that are prerequisites for modern business. There is no the new normal. Let's banish that phrase completely. There is no normal either. Change is continuous. Everything is now different. We need to listen, we need to learn, we need to unlearn, we need to change. And it's all about the way we think about that for our future success. Sure, if we don't, we're going to be in serious trouble. So, thoughts for you to ponder on. Thank you for staying with us while we've enjoyed that. If you would like the slides that I've developed for you, you're welcome to email them to me as well. Chris, I'm sure if I hand back to you now, we can go back to hand back to you as the moderator, and he'll give you my email address. I'll type it into the chat box for you as well. Just drop me an email and I'm happy to send you the slide deck that you can think about and go through, as well as answer any other questions with you that you might have as well. So let me type that back in, grab a much needed drink of water and hand back to you, Chris.
Great presentation as always. Thank you, Michael. Fascinating and some wonderful insights in there. I will be, Michael, if you can share the presentation with me, I will very happily share it with anyone. Similarly, if anyone would like Michael's contact details, I will be able to pass those on. If there are any questions, please do type those into the Q&A box, and I'll be able to pose those through to Michael now. But I mean, Michael, thank you very much. I mean, as I say, fascinating, insightful, important points.
Thank you, much appreciated. Martina, thank you for your comments as well. And Deepavali, no problem at all. Thank you for yours. I'm happy to take questions on this. I've spent, most of my life trying to study change and understand it. So, in fact, I'm currently broadcasting to you from my home office in South Africa. I should have been in the UK by now, but I couldn't travel and our airport's closed. We're all on lockdown at that level as well. But I said to my wife, as we went into one of the hardest lockdowns in the world, it was kind of extraordinary that we went into 3 weeks of lockdown, first of all. When it was over, I said to my wife, no, please, let's stay with it. And then, thank goodness, the South African president extended it longer. It gave me a chance for me to reassess my own business instead of doing, what you do, Chris, flying around the world constantly. I did 186 hotel nights delivering speeches in 2019. Right now, I'm broadcasting to you from my dining room, a room I'd never used in my house that I've lived in for 10 years. So it's kind of extraordinary. I'm glad we're in lockdown in many respects. Authentic leadership. Rhonda would like to know a little bit about that. I think, I don't want to use it as a cliche, Rhonda. I think that authentic leadership is leadership that's in touch with its people and its markets. That it was kind of extraordinary for me. I was looking for examples of authentic leadership when lockdown began, because companies just froze. Governments just froze, as I mentioned. And I think what happened on that was that, having used all of my social media platforms that I have, LinkedIn and Facebook and whatever, I was asking people around the world to show me examples of any good, solid or authentic leadership, if you will, Rhonda. And there were so few examples of it that came out. First of all, there was the typical business response. And I think you can go and Google all COVID commercials on YouTube. And there's a guy in the States, I shared it on my social media platform a couple of weeks ago. He'd put together a video montage in America, sadly, but of every single American advertiser who'd made a COVID campaign commercial. And it was all snippets of them, a second, and they were all saying exactly the same thing. Oh, we know it's hard right now. We know there's lockdown. We're really here for you. We love you. We might be on reduced staff and staying at home like you, but as soon as the world changes, we want you to know that we're back and we care. Blah, blah, blah. There's no authentic leadership in any style of that messaging whatsoever. But if you go to YouTube and now look for Nando's, and it's ironic that I'm talking to you from South Africa, a brand that most of you will know quite well on its global travels. It's done exceptionally well. Robbie Brosen broadcast a message to his staff, and it's called Nando's lockdown, if you go and Google it, it's not a commercial. It was his message as a leader telling his Nandokas, the people who work inside Nando's, why they were turning off the flame for the very first time temporarily, and what they would be doing during that lockdown, and why they would be back bigger and better than ever before. It's probably one of the best video depictions that I could ever see of authentic leadership. Not only had he listened, but he communicated to his people in their language. There was no drama. It was cool, calm, collected, and conversational. And I think that, you know, most of us don't believe the hyperbole of business or governments anymore. We want to be spoken with, not spoken to. So I hope, Rhonda, that helps at some level. I see Saki. Hello, Saki. Great content as always, Michael. Thank you, sir. Wow. What's your advice for anyone in the tourism industry? Repurpose. Okay, and I'm not going to say find the new normal, and I'm not going to use the word pivot, which is a word I exclusively wanted not even to use in this broadcast, so I won't, apart from mentioning it once. I think, Saki, that the idea for the tourism industry is that we become incredibly complacent. I think we all expected to fight for a little bit of a market share. We sent it out, you know, pretty much the same as we always had, whether you were in cruise ships, whether you were in wildlife destinations, whether you were in bed and breakfasts, or whether you were in certain historical towns, wherever you come from in the tourism industry, we delivered more of the same. There'd been an upswing recently of more authentic tourism, and maybe that responds well to that new hierarchy that I showed you, the new version of Maslow's 2020 hierarchy. People want a sense of purpose. They want the instant gratification. They want the social media connectivity. They want to be able to show and tell, but they also want to connect that within a sense of purpose. If that is a brand new trend out of people in our marketplace today, shouldn't we be repackaging ourselves to that audience in that way, in that style? And I think that there's an awful lot the tourism industry can do to avoid being complacent. I think we've all, as not only in tourism, but in every other industry, been utterly and completely complacent. And it takes a radical leader to really shake things up. You know, when I worked for Richard Branson originally, although I can never work for Richard Branson again after what he said to me, 2 words that were horrendous. He said, "You're fired." And he fired me because I got complacent when working with him. It was the most incredible thing. But when I worked for Branson, he was the pioneer. Everyone looked to Virgin. Today, Virgin is ridiculed. Branson himself is really taking a hiding at the moment, asking for government furlough money out of the UK government when he's living in tax exile. And most of his companies are in fact foreign owned anyway. I mean, it's amazing how the world has turned. And you look at an airline that's leading today, you've got to look at Qatar Airways. Akbar Al-Bakr this morning talking about the fact that they are now one of the biggest airlines in the world, and they've repurposed and repackaged themselves to talk about flying people home on repatriation flights. They had the fleet, they had the staff, they've built a brand new level of service, by the way, that left Virgin in the dust years ago. But now what they're doing, they've offered 100,000 tickets to health workers for as soon as they can fly, free of charge, to go and use their their fleet and literally travel to any destination for a well-earned break that they would like to do so. And people could apply. What a smart marketing thing that was. So I think we've got to repackage in many, many levels. Which country, Leanne Kelly says, Kelly Martin says, which country do you believe has dealt best with the new abnormal? I don't know. I'm tempted to say Sweden, Leanne, up front. But I see that, you know, Chris, you've got something on that maybe you can come in and just take that through for me.
Oh, well, that's a difficult one. I think Sweden has dealt with it in a very interesting way because they never really went down into lockdown. So they've sort of embraced the change very quickly rather than necessarily reacting specifically to it. So I tend to agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me that Sweden in its own right didn't freeze. The rest of the world's governments froze. So I think that by not freezing, they were looking for a new way to build through what is a devastating virus. And, let's extend our sympathy to everyone who's been affected by it. It's been a terrible, bloody virus for which as yet there is no cure. But it can't stop the entire world's globalized economy. And in many respects, that leads me into Angelo's question about how do you study, learn, and then unlearn? I think what happens with us, Angelo, is the human brain absorbs an awful lot of stuff. We're force-fed that from a very early age. And in fact, we're force-fed facts and information. And at school, we're asked to ultimately regurgitate as much of those facts or as many of those facts and as much of the information as we possibly can. And it becomes diktat. It becomes operating procedure. The more you can remember from what's out there, the more you're a smart person. You get higher grades at that level. Your brain doesn't like learning new stuff. It takes an awful long time to learn new habits by forcing yourself to do something different, because our brains become exceptionally complacent. But it shows how quickly we can unlearn and relearn and do new things when a competitor in your industry starts to do something magnificent because it's brand new and has never been done before. Instantly, everybody then thinks that's the new way to go, and we follow like sheep. So the idea is you've got to talk to people and you've got to listen to what an audience wants and then give it that back. No more, no less. And don't give them what you think is the right answer, because that's our instinctive belief out of all of our learnings. Let me give you another example. I think Tintswalo Safari Lodge were at the Experience Africa thing a year ago as well. And I remember enormously, well, two things really stood out for me there. One of them was the Tintswalo experience. I've been privileged. It's very expensive to go to Tintswalo, as many of the top-end safari operators are. And I wondered, as much as anybody did, having been to one just before lockdown, how they would cope. Now, what did they have? They had their bush. Tintswalo Safari Lodge in the Manyeleti Game Reserve in South Africa still had their reserve. They still had the animals. They still had their people who were locked down inside the reserve. They had the vehicles to travel around. So they decided that they would run a virtual game drive. But it wasn't just a virtual game drive. It was the best of what the rangers had seen that they edited the night before. And they realized very strongly that what was happening was Zoom fatigue, that people were fed up with spending all day on meetings like this. So they promoted themselves as saying, come and have a virtual game drive with us over a cup of coffee. Come and just chat with us over a cup of coffee. We'll give you 10 minutes of what it looked like in the bush yesterday. On their first day on Facebook, they took 100,000 downloads of their first video. Remarkable. Every single operator has now followed suit. Now, come on, that can't have been the only idea in the tourism industry so far. What else can we come up with that's unusual? Because if you'd said to Tintswalo Safari Lodge, gosh, we're going to give you a campaign to reach 100,000 good people in social media terms, it's going to cost you X, they would have gone, oh, can't afford that. Never have done it. But they pioneered something and they led it, and I thought that that was absolutely sensational. It is kind of remarkable that when you start thinking of new things, Angelo, you're unlearning what you believe you've always had in the past. So I hope those give you a few answers to those questions. Chris, back to you, sir.
Thank you, Michael. And I think your last comment actually moves us very nicely on to our next stage, time to get a drink. Maybe something a little stronger than a coffee, because it's probably a time for a time-appropriate beverage. So I'm just popping the link for the social meeting in the chat box. So please do come and join us there, and we can continue a little bit less formal chat with everyone else on camera with microphone and everything. So please do join us. I'll be stopping the webinar now. I'm going to my fridge and getting a nice cold drink, and then I'll see you back all here in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'll see you there as well. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you.